Exciting part of IHS for me. 5 years ago, a bunch of us that have been doing this for about 20 or 25 years, we looked around St. Louis maybe. I can't remember what meeting it was 5 years ago. Anyway, we looked around and IHS, the crowd kind of looked like God's waiting room. And we realized we got to get some young people in here. So we brainstormed very briefly and created a junior herpetologist program. And we're still working out the bugs and the kinks, as you guys will discover. But this is our 4th year. Applicants in 3 different age groups. It's a contest, basically an essay contest. They can pick several different categories. They send in letters of recommendation and cover letters. We have judges review them and rank them. The winners in each category get an all expenses paid trip to IHS, including airfare, hotel for them, and a chaperone. And we're very excited about what's developed and what's going to develop in the future. So with that, I'd like to introduce our first speaker. This is Michael Skipstead from California. He's the winner in our 12 to 15 age group, and he's going to speak about alligator snapping turtles.
Hello everyone, my name is Michael Skipstead. I'm from Orange County, California, and I'll just give a little introduction about myself and then I'll get into my talk. But first of all, I'm a turtle nerd, and for those of you turtle nerds, you know Orange County and California in general, it's kind of lacking in turtles. We have a pond turtle and sliders, and I work with both of those, but it's definitely not a turtle nerd's dreamland. So it's good to be here in Texas. But so some of the work that I do a lot of work with the Turtle Survival Alliance. We're all go around the country in various places, including Texas, to do the Comal Springs sampling, where we look for snapping turtles, not alligator snapping turtles, but common snapping turtles and some other species that we sample. And about 4 weeks ago, I was also in Madagascar working on the radiated tortoise confiscation, and ended up getting sick and spent 4 nights in a hospital with some chikungunya virus. So the trip was fun, but that wasn't. So I'm currently a freshman going into high school, and I'm missing football camp right now. But this is more important. So let's get going here. I'll start talking about this. And is this the? Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the family of snapping turtles. It's Chelidradae, and as you can see, it's a family about 60 million years in the making. And so there are 5 species in this family, and a lot of people will say 2 and possibly 7. But for the sake of this talk, I'm going to go with 5. Within the past 10 years or so, there have been a lot of revisions to actually how many there are. They split all the common snapping turtle subspecies into the full species, and synonymized what we call the Florida snapping turtle with the common snapping turtle, and split the snapping turtles, the alligator snapping turtles, which we'll be talking about, into 3 species, and then someone else synonymized, Guy in 2015 synonymized, which means put one Apalachicola, which was one of the snapping turtles that they split in the alligator family back into the 2, so they're in 2 species now. But these are some of the ranges in the bottom. They span from the state line of Iowa in Macrokellies, and that's probably Venezuela. I think I'm not sure exactly where that is, but that's one of the maps on there. So we'll go here. So a little bit of evolutionary history, just a quick overview. The first snapping turtle that we know of is Denver's Middletoni, and it was about 64 million years old from what we know so far. And this is what we call, this clade up here is called a crown chelydrids, and so this includes extant species and extinct ones. And there are 8 extinct snapping turtles that we know of so far. And so now I'm going to talk a little bit about an evolutionary history dilemma between the common and alligator snapping turtle, which is kind of interesting in evolutionary history that there is an overlap, at least that scientists have noted. So this turtle called Macrokellies floridana was described in 1907 by Hay, And so later on in Thomas's 2014 review of all the extant snapping turtles, so the one species at the time where he split them, he also reviewed Macrochelys floridana, the extinct species, and he thought it looked more like a calliope, which is a common snapping turtle. And Joyce agreed in 2017 with this belief. So it does look like floridana might be a common snapping turtle after all, but we're still really figuring that out, so it's interesting. So I'm not sure why that's off, but disregard that. So snappers get large. This is the natural history. And for those of you that have seen a snapping turtle in the wild, you know that this is a huge animal. Specimens up to 200 pounds are pretty rare, but the record was 249 pounds. And there have been reports, site reports from people that see them, and they claim that they're 400 pounds. And there was one in Indiana in 1959 called the Beast of Busco that surfaced, and 50 people all yelled that it was 400 pounds, and that didn't get documented anywhere, but it's possible that there is an animal that is that big. So another interesting thing is there's an urban legend or a myth that snappers, well, somewhat of a myth, can break a broomstick, and some people will say that they can even go through some crazy stuff, like a tree branch. I've heard like a whole tree, but it's really actually hard for them to break a broomstick. Pritchard in 1980 went and did a little MythBuster thing where he took a broomstick, and it took the snapper, I think, about 5 bites to get through that thing and really saw through. So that's interesting, but they can't take a finger off. There's a report from Ulay Bass in Pritchard's book as well, where he said that he didn't know his finger was gone until his son pointed out in the bottom of the boat. So they can't take it off. They can't take a finger off. So a little more morphology, and this appears to be off as well. So something went wrong here, but that's fine. So just a little quick shell and skull morphology, and I have a little shell up here for reference. I'll come stand up here. So snappers have long costiform processes, and you can't really see them, but they're really prominent at the top of the shell, the interior portion, and those are extensions of the vertebrae. And so this is a really interesting fact that I didn't know until I read Pritchard's book, but these holes right here, they're called plastral or carapacial fontanelles, which are essentially growth holes, and these are between what we call the pleural bones and the peripheral bones. And so later on, when the snapper reaches full growth, those will ossify. And that's an interesting thing because males get a lot larger than females in this species, and you can tell if you've got a female shell, which is, I'm guessing, or you can tell you've got a male shell, I'm guessing what that is, because you can see the fontanelles. So for the skull, it's an anapsid reptile, like most. Well, all of them actually, and very posteriorly emarginate skull, so you can see if you look at a picture of the skull, I don't have one here. They also have a large occipital condylus, which is, in comparison to other, maybe a musk turtle, the occipital condylus might have the same ratio to the skull, but it's large just because they have big skulls. So this is another interesting thing about the morphology. This is the lure, and what this is essentially is it's supposed to be a worm. And when I was going through all the literature, mainly Walter Joyce did a review of all extinct snapping turtles, and there's nothing really about where they acquired this trait. So that's really something I'm interested in looking into in the future. But so essentially, they'll inflate this nerve, this extension of the lingual nerve with blood, and it'll move around in the mouth. They'll open the mouth on the bottom of the river, and this thing will kind of wiggle like it is a worm, and a fish will swim in, and they'll shut their jaws on the fish, and that's what it's used for. And it's a really fascinating thing. And a lot of people say, well, that looks like an extinct dinosaur. To have that sort of an evolutionary process, something within this extinct animal is really not so primitive. It's really modernized, which is very interesting. And so the epithelium of this nerve, we split it into 2 trunks. You can even see the split there. The posterior epithelium consists of 2 different types of epithelium. We have the lamina epithelialis and the lamina propria, and then within the lamina epithelialis we have the tunica mucosa, and within the lamina propria we have the tunica submucosa. So that's this histologically what would be on this. So diet, I won't cover this too much, but they're opportunistic. A lot of people, I've actually seen this quoted, turtles are opportunistic omnivores, a lot of the species, and that is true to some extent. They'll pretty much eat anything they come into contact with, mainly meat, fish, they use that lure for, some mollusks, and Redmond is quoted as saying that in the Flint River, Georgia, snappers have large maxilla and mandibles, maybe to crush mollusks more so than some other species. And Al Redmond was very, very critical, and he probably did. The Flint River still has a good population of snappers, and he released snappers. He would grow them on his property and then release babies. And in 1 year, I think he got about 3,000 into the water, so that was big. And so I was interested in looking at maybe how the 21st century has adopted snapping turtles, and this is a little odd. It's not supposed to be like that, but the top was indented, so I'm sorry again. But as a lot of species have, snappers have become invasive in some places, even in California. You can see that's Bob. He lived in a Lake Fullerton, which is really close to my house, and they actually put a bounty, whoever could catch him and then transport him would win like $2,000 or something like that. It was pretty crazy. And so there's one in the river in Russia and one in China, and they've obviously made it into captivity. Like a lot of turtles have, and they've made it on TV, and some of you may be familiar with the people holding those, and there's also one of them from Oklahoma, which is pretty interesting. That was apparently a size record, but it was only 120 pounds, so I don't know who was judging that. But so let's talk a little bit about conservation, and I think conservation is something it's really important if we're not going to lose the species. And so first of all, snappers in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s were really popular in the meat trade, and you could find them for sale at a lot of, especially in the southeastern coast, a lot of restaurants would be selling them. Paul Prudhomme, who's a famous chef and wrote a lot of books, he would even sell them at his restaurant, and they were cooked in soup. So George and Pritchard, Peter Pritchard, he's probably one of the most well-recognized and respected turtle biologist. He's written, I think, 11 books. They went out and interviewed the people who were actually responsible for catching these turtles and transporting them to the restaurants. And so he went and talked to these people, and it's crazy. A large quantity of the people he interviewed actually said this species needs help. And that's an interesting thing. And in multiple interviews, he said, I think that's, many people can come and say that this turtle needs help, but the people that are actually making a living for killing them, if they're saying that they need help, then they really do. So he thought that they should be federally listed, and we'll talk a little bit about the future from the past. So snappers are now, as of 2018, they're vulnerable in the IUCN. Which just essentially is a referable, it's a resource for anyone who wants to list them, just so they compile information and kind of make a status based on a bunch of studies. So they're also Appendix 3 on CITES, which means that they are trade is it's regulated loosely, so you need permits to import and export for sale. So this is the thing that's really good. We're really making progress in this, but they're protected in all states of occurrence. So snappers in some way are protected in all states they occur in, whether it be a bag limit to just no turtle capture of any sort, but they are protected by each state. They're not federally protected yet, but we are working towards that hopefully for the future, or hopefully we don't need to do that in the future. They'll be recovered enough. So what needs to get done in the end? This is interesting. Dreslick in 2017 did a study. It was a 3-state recovery program, including Illinois, where they haven't seen a snapping turtle in, I believe, 30 years. So they have a 3-pronged approach for how we deal with the conservation of snappers. And one is releasing turtles. So yes, we have to incorporate the captive situation where we're head starting the species and then releasing them back. And I want to add that definitely before we can release them, there needs to be a designated area to do so. But that's not really a problem. There are plenty of places we can do that, especially when it's spanning 3 states. And so 2 is population monitoring protocols. And I want to relate this to a lot of, there's been all sorts of issues like this, but especially with Gopherus tortoises. There have been lots of issues with when they translocate tortoises off of properties onto new ones. No one does anything to, and now that's completely changed, but maybe 30 or 40 years ago, there were plenty of cases where people would just drop them on a new property and assume they survive, and they don't. And so that's kind of the same thing with this. If we just release hatchlings, well, we might be contributing something, but a lot of you will know that 1 in 1,000 turtles, based on estimates, will make it to adulthood. So if we release 500 to 1,000, maybe that's only 1 or no survival, so we need to know. And so 3 is just kind of it's an extension of population monitoring protocols. We need to watch for survival rates, population modeling, and individual growth rates. And survival rates is really interesting because once we can gauge survival, if it's really good, then we know we're doing something right. And if it's if the survival rate is it's not good, then we know that something's wrong here. We can make edits to what we're doing and potentially find a new site. So one more thing before I finish here is there have been a lot of studies and especially just relating it back to maybe the 1900s and then going to the 20th century. We have these people, the snappers were definitely not as endangered back then, but documentation is limited, but we have famous naturalists, and lots of people did eat them, but not to the extent they did in the mid-20th century. So with these famous naturalists, 100 years later, we had a generation who liked snappers as meat. And so I'm thinking if we have a generation that's upcoming that are into the conservation of these turtles, then we need the next generation to just be prolonging what this generation set out and so forth. So we need the future in mind when we're doing these things, because releasing the turtles, it's great to boost the population, but we need someone who can we need a new generation who's going to keep that population boosted as opposed to just making it plummet again. So that's my presentation. Thank you. This was a snapping turtle actually here caught in Houston at the TSA. But thank you for having me. It's really an honor to be a junior herpetologist this year. Thank you.